Have you ever had the discussion with your children about addiction, the different substances that they can get addicted to, or how these substances affect young people's developing brains? Did you know that substance addiction is about 50% genetic? Are you hiding behind a lack of information? Do you fear discussing drugs and alcohol with your kids? Well, welcome to the club. You're really not alone. Today's guest, Jessica Lahey, is here to gift us with both her personal story of addiction and the research and information that she's gathered about addiction and substance use to help educate parents and caregivers. I'm Kate Mason and welcome to Parenting and Personalities. This is the podcast that connects you to the ones you care about the most. Jessica Lahey is a teacher, writer and mum, and is the author of the New York Times bestselling book, The Gift of Failure, How the Best Parents Learn to Let Go so Their Children Can Succeed, and The Addiction Inoculation, Raising Healthy Kids in a Culture of Dependence. For over 20 years, Jess has taught every grade from 6th to 12th in both public and private schools and spent 5 years teaching in a drug and alcohol rehab for adolescents in Vermont. She's written about education and parenting and child welfare for The Washington Post, The Atlantic, and her bi-weekly column, The Parent-Teacher Conference, which ran for 3 years at the New York Times. She co-hosts the #AmWriting podcast from her empty nest in Vermont. Hi Jessica, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about a very different topic to the last podcast, which was about your book, The Gift of Failure, written for us helicopter parents out there. Today we're talking about addiction and your book, The Addiction Inoculation, Raising Healthy Kids in a culture of dependence. Now, this is another really personal story for you. So could you please share that with us?
Yeah, sure. So I thank you, first of all, for having me on again. So much fun. So I'm an alcoholic, and I realized that I knew that for a long time before I finally said it out loud. But I had gotten in real trouble with alcohol in my early 40s. And so I've been sober for about 10 years now. But about the time I got sober, I realized, oh, hang on a second. I was raised by an alcoholic. One of my parents was raised by an alcoholic, and so on, and so on, and so on. And then over on my husband's side of the family, there's people with substance use disorder all throughout his family tree as well. So I was like, hold on a second. Does this mean that my kids are like doomed? Like, so I started to read about substance use prevention in kids, not just substance use prevention, but substance use disorder prevention. And is that even a thing? Like, can we even do that? So I think I said this last time on your show that, I have this incredibly cool job where I get curious about something and then I just research the heck out of it for 2 years and write about it. And as it turns out, my kids are not doomed. Like, yes, right. Genetics is part of it. And yes, epigenetics is part of it. And yes, environment is part of it. But substance use prevention works. And I can't guarantee that my kids will not develop substance use disorder. But you better believe I'm going to do everything I can to weigh the scales, in the favor of not developing. So, I also want to make it really clear that, for parents of kids who do suffer from substance use disorder, they didn't do anything wrong. Often, kids get there by many different ways. But at the same time, as a researcher, and a journalist, I just needed to figure out what's true, what's false, what's myth, what's reality, and then just do the best we can with the tools that we have at the moment.
Because as a young person, you actually did the best you could initially, didn't you?
Uh-huh. Yeah, well, but at the same time, I did. I was scared to death of alcohol. I stayed far away from it as a young person. But at the same time, I was also not allowed to talk about the fact that I had a parent who was an alcoholic, and we had to, I think I talk about this a lot, is that I think one reason that I love words and language so much is because I love that it can be precise. And I was not allowed to be precise with what I talked about. I had to use euphemisms like, oh, my parent is taking a nap, or my parent has a headache, not my parent is unconscious, that kind of thing. And I think it's been interesting being able to give people examples of language that talk about the thing in a precise way so that we can do something about it, as opposed to whining about it or worrying about it or getting anxiety about it, so that we can feel like we have, if not full control, at least the ability to say, I did everything I could. And that, that's an amazing feeling. And I really do think that, like if my kids were to develop substance use disorder, yeah, I put lots of risk on one side of their scale. But on the other hand, there is this peace in feeling like you've done your best.
Yeah. So reading, is it about 50% genetics? Is that what you come up with, or is it 60? What's your kind of point on that?
So the best numbers we have actually come from Mark Schuckett and his research at UCSD. And it's about 50 to 60% of the risk picture. So if you have a first or second degree relative with substance use disorder, yes, you and your children, likely have an increased risk for substance use disorder. However, that said, my sister isn't an alcoholic. My sister has a perfectly healthy relationship with alcohol, whereas I cannot moderate my alcohol use. I have no choice but to never touch alcohol again, because that's the only way I can be sure that I'll be alive tomorrow.
Yes.
So, and on the other hand, also, my husband had the same genetic risk that I have, and he doesn't have a problem with substances. So, there's a lot of, and the genetics of it are complicated. It's not just like, oh, we can identify this one gene and then flick it out of the picture. It's not like that. And we're learning so much so quickly. I'm so indebted to the researchers. In fact, I got to go to a meeting last year where the Research Society on Alcohol, and they gave my book an award for sort of the best book that year that sort of conveyed this research to the popular whatever. But without those researchers, they're everything. They're doing all the important work right now. I'm just translating it.
Yeah, I was going to say, but you're spreading the news, and that's equally important, because how often does the public go and read the research papers? So, it's a win-win situation, honestly.
Well, it's a win-win for me too, because I'm a big geek and I love doing the research.
Yeah.
And I live in a family of big geeks.
Which is great. You must have great conversations because,
Well, it's really funny with my editor. Every once in a while in the margin, it'll say something like jargon or they don't care, or like, because I'm an overwriter. I tend to write more about the geeky details. And then my editor is like, no one cares, Jess. That's fascinating, but no one cares. And so then my chapters end up being about half as long.
Well, that's good, because for people like me that really don't care either, I'm not a researcher, and I love your books, so I think that you and the editor are doing a great job, because it's just the right blend. It's readable. It doesn't go too heavily into the area that you might, but it really sets you out with the facts. Look, just briefly, where does addiction start, in the sense of when our children go out and like the behaviors? You talk about alcohol, and I know a friend of mine works in that kind of area and says alcohol is the beginning of most things. So where do you kind of feel with that?
Yeah, what she's talking about is sort of a mostly debunked theory called the gateway theory, that, kids tend to start with smoking or vaping and then move on to smoking, and then, or start with beer and wine and then move on to something harder. That doesn't hold across groups, diverse groups in terms of like, anyway, between boys, girls, ethnicities, it doesn't hold. However, I love these words by Chris Herron. Chris Herron was a professional basketball player here in the U.S. and became addicted to opiates. And he talks a lot about the fact that we tend to talk a lot about the last day, like all the horror stories. I could tell you about my last day of drinking. It was awful. It was terrible. I never want to think about it ever again. But those are the war stories that people usually want to hear about. But instead of talking about that last day, what we should be talking about is the first day. What is it that makes a kid feel not enough? What is it that in addiction inoculation, I talk about one of my former students, Georgia, who by the time I met her in high school was a daily drinker. The water bottle next to her desk did not have water in it. And Georgia and I talked about this extensively. And by the way, that's her real name. She was insistent. Both Brian and Georgia, Brian's another kid I profile in the book, they both felt it was so important to use their real name because they wanted their experience to be worth something to other people in terms of learning. But Georgia suffered from really debilitating anxiety, and it just was never addressed. I mean, they looked to see why she was having stomach aches, but no one ever thought to ask her about her absolutely crippling anxiety. And then when she heard somewhere that alcohol can make you not feel things, she was like, ding, 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 ding. I want to not feel things, or I want to feel more than, or I want to feel better than, or I just don't want to hurt anymore. The kids, I used to teach in a rehab for adolescents, and many of my students had endured massive childhood trauma, and childhood trauma is a huge risk factor for substance use, especially sexual and physical abuse, or having no control over your world. Kids who grow up, for example, in the foster care system don't have any say in where they live and when they move and all that sort of stuff. And they develop a really low sense of self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is the feeling that if you make a decision or take action, that you can change outcomes. And for many of those kids, they can't change their outcomes, at least in the short term. So giving kids a really great sense of self-efficacy, helping them feel more competent, helping them feel like they're good enough as they are, that we love them and not some other kid that we wish they had, that we don't just love them based on their grades and ports and scores, that we love them. And yes, maybe they're interested in becoming a musician and we feel like that's not a worthwhile use of your time. When we love them and not some imagined version of them, or not the kid we wish we had, or not the kid we thought we had, that's when we build these really deep connections that can help, not 100% can help prevent their need to go someplace else to feel that elevated self-worth, whether that's out of a bottle or a pill or whatever.
So with that, when a child gets offered something, what are you hoping to have? We've got that resilience sitting in there.
Right.
Let's say they're well loved and well heard. What about the peer pressure and the you should do it, it's fun, and and like you say, they're teenagers and their brains are just and they're into risk taking. So what else is there in there that you're going to inoculate them with?
So, of course, backing up again, kids who are well loved and well supported do drugs and alcohol all the time, and some of them become, dependent. I want to start there. Don't want any parents to feel like they didn't do enough. However, here's what, ideally, in an ideal world, here's what I want a kid to know. What I want a kid to know is that drug and alcohol use with their unfinished brains, that period from one of the biggest periods of brain reconstruction and development is from puberty to the early to mid-20s. What I want for them to know is that during that period from puberty to the early to mid-20s, that drugs and alcohol are much more harmful to the human brain than they are after that period. So the longer we can delay their use during that period, not only is their brain more able to develop unimpeded, also, key note here, the lower their lifelong risk of developing substance use disorder is. So if an 8th grader takes their first drink or drug, their lifelong risk for substance use disorder is 50%, almost 50%. If they wait 2 more years till 10th grade, it drops in half. And if they wait 2 more years till 12th grade, it drops in half again. So that's really important to know. Further, I want kids to know things like, when an 8th grader comes to them and says, oh, it's no big deal, everybody's doing it. If they know, well, A, it is a big deal in my developing brain because it's not done yet. And B, no, everybody's not doing it because I happen to know that they don't have to repeat this, but only 24.7% of 8th graders in the U.S. report they've had more than a sip of alcohol by the end of 8th grade. So that's a lie. Anytime they have that information, that you talked about information as power, understanding what it does to substances do to the adolescent brain. And I talk about what they do. I talk about what cannabis does. I talk about alcohol does. I talk about what speed does, all of these things. What it does to the adolescent brain, how the earlier they start using the higher their lifelong risk of having issues with drugs and alcohol later is. And understanding that just because we feel something doesn't mean we need to numb it. The problem is that so often what they hear is, oh my gosh, I had such a bad day at work. I really need a drink. Or we're going to the holidays at grandma's house and boy, I hope there's enough wine there because that's the only way I'm going to get through this. When they hear that, what they're hearing is, I have bad emotions or I have uncomfortable emotions, so I drink at them or I take this pill at them. The more they understand that, the more it's obviously a logical reason to use, right? This is uncomfortable, so I'm going to use. Rather than, and I think I mentioned this in our last time together, I started to drink because I had really bad social anxiety and it made it a lot. The drink I miss the most is the one I can't have now before I go to a party, just so that I can get over that threshold discomfort. But I've had to actually deal with that threshold discomfort on a very real level. And I'm not going to say it's gone, but at least I understand where it's coming from. And I have some actual tools in my tool belt now to alleviate it, rather than just drinking at it and making it go away.
So more social cues or more things around it, going in with somebody.
Just taking a deep breath, realizing that everyone there is as I get imposter syndrome, I get social anxiety, and I just have to remember that other people do too, and we're all just human beings. Yeah,
and I think that is the thing about fear is that knowing that other people are as uncomfortable as you probably, it's the old, I remember back in the day, someone said to me, look, when you're looking at your audience, just imagine that they're all on the toilet. And I was like, that wasn't really something that I really wanted to imagine, but okay, it's kind of like, everyone's human.
I used to say to my middle school students, it really does feel like you're being watched all the time, but everyone feels like that and they're worried about themselves. Yes. And so if everyone's paying attention to their own stuff and you're being watched less often than you think. Yeah. And so, just remembering that, I'm not saying it's true all the time, but just remembering that is a powerful tool for feeling like, okay, I can take a breath. I'm not being watched by everybody right now.
Yeah, that's a great thing. And like you say with the modeling, as a parent modeling for a child, I mean, there we go, it's another thing for parents to do. But in all essence, kids pick up stuff from very early, don't they? When you realize how early your child will grab something, later on they'll say something, even when they're older like mine are, and I think, oh my goodness, did you see, you recognize that back when you were 6 or 5 or whatever. It's quite scary how much they do pick up from your behaviors and what you do. And it once again too, with your disciplining around it, I must admit, I always paint, I wish I'd read your book, but I didn't at the time. But I didn't drink. I don't drink anyway because I know that when I drink, I'm loud and obnoxious, so I choose not to. So am
I, but it didn't stop me.
I had to make too many phone calls to people after I'd been out with them for the night, and I was like, nah, I'm over this. And so, but with my children, I did say to my daughter, my son was straight as a die. He wasn't drinking. 18 was the age we were allowed to drink here in Australia, and 18 was, 2 weeks before was the first time he touched alcohol, and I think he had every liqueur that was in someone's cabinet and was very, very drunk and didn't drink for ages after. But my daughter, I would say, alcohol's bad. It's not good for your brain. That, it will make your behavior bad. But I want you to ring me if you're drunk because I want to come and pick you up and I want to be able to bring you home. So I kind of read her the riot act. If I had more facts up my sleeve, like you've just told me, I would have given her every single fact that I could possibly have done because it worked. It did work. She did get drunk sometimes, not too, probably about 16, 17, and she would ring me up and I would go and pick her up. She would feel terrible. I would hold her hair out of the bowl and I'd just say, I'm never doing this again. Yes. But,
that's an important contract, and I even make a sample contract for that. That was something I always knew in the back of my head, that I had the ability to call my parents if I needed them. And the other promise they had made to me is that we wouldn't talk about it that night, that we would talk about it later, sort of after the emergency had passed. But, in so many ways, understanding that having these conversations, you know, talking about substance use and substance use disorder is really upsetting and emotional. And for some parents, it scares them to death. But I can tell you right now, the more often we have these conversations, the less scary they are. And the more honesty we have around these conversations, the more opportunities there are to learn. I mean, when one year one of my parents relapsed and on alcohol, and we essentially called off Christmas. It was incredibly traumatic. We had to leave. My sister had to stay in a hotel with her children. It was awful. But we didn't say, oh, someone got sick. We said, no, we said your grandparent, you know, is having a problem with alcohol, and it's my job as your parent to keep you safe. And I care about your grandparents so much. And the sooner they realize that there are real consequences for this, which is not being able to spend Christmas with you, the sooner they might get help. And, you know, that's just one of the things that we do when we're trying to teach our kids and show them the consequences of that, you know, their actions can have real consequences.
And
so, yeah.
Adding in on that, as an alcoholic, when do people decide? Is it usually a major thing that goes wrong? You know, do you get what I mean?
That's a really great question. That's a really, really great question. I describe it as a 100-piece puzzle. And although I would love to be that 100th piece that slots into place for everyone, like I would recently had an experience where a woman, this is so classic, a woman, I was sitting at a bar at a restaurant because I was eating by myself. And this very, very drunk woman came up to me, and the people next to her were a little rude to her because she was so drunk. And she turned to me and she said, "Am I too drunk?" And I said, "Well, yeah, a little bit." And we ended up having a conversation, and I ended up asking for her text so that I could text her and make sure she made it home okay. And my talking to her that evening probably is not anything that was going to change her life. Because, like I said, it's that 100th piece sliding into place is really rare. However, I bet you it was piece 72. And for piece 100 to slide into place, piece 72 has to be in place. For my kids, I don't know that they will never, I can't guarantee if I do everything perfectly, one of them has a pretty high chance of having substance use disorder at some point. But all of this prevention stuff are also pieces of that puzzle. I know piece 2 is there, and I know piece 24 is there. And I can just hope that if their drinking or drug use begins to be a problem for them, that they're at piece 80 instead of at piece 36. So these are all tools and all learning moments. And, you know, I wish nothing but the best for that woman at that airport bar. And I just hope, like, clearly there's something going on there. And I really, really hope she gets there someday. But, you know, I wasn't piece 100 for her. And that's cool. That's cool because someone else will be, hopefully.
Yes. Yeah. So when do we start? You know, when do you start the inoculation process? I mean, we usually do it at, you know, pretty around 6 months old. So when do you think we should start the whole thing?
So it's infuriating when I send copies of my book to high school administrators. First of all, in the U.S., only 57% of high schools here have any substance use prevention program. And of that 57%, only 10% are based on any kind of evidence of efficacy. So that's a problem. I send my book to a lot of administrators in elementary schools and middle schools and high schools. And the elementary school administrators say, "Oh, great, but I sent that on to the high school administrators because this is an elementary school." The best substance use prevention programs that we know of start between family and education programs start in pre-K and kindergarten. And that means that we're talking to pre-K and kindergarten age kids about things we put in our mouth and things we don't. Yes, a lot of medications look like candy, but before you pick that thing off the floor and put it in your mouth, talk to mommy or daddy or whomever you trust about that. We don't swallow the toothpaste. We spit toothpaste out because toothpaste can go on the top of our teeth, but it shouldn't go down in our tummies because there are some things that stay on the outside and some things that stay on the inside. And those are all conversations you have. And then moving up to things like why is there a name on this prescription bottle? Like, why, if you had the same illness I have, could you take it? No, of course not. This medication is for me, not you. And you should never take a medication that has someone else's name on it. So we're building all of those conversations so that as the kid starts to notice things out in the world, or as something comes up in the media, or as something comes up in our family, we're able to handle that in a developmentally appropriate way. And those programs go all the way up until they're off to wherever it is after high school.
And so why is there such a lack? Because this is a really huge problem, and especially since, has everywhere in the States legalized marijuana?
No, only some states.
Only some.
20 states, I think. Anyway, but it's a couple of things. There's a lot, like, for parents who have their own issues, it's certainly not something that we want to talk about. Like, I'm a hypocrite. If, I would feel like a hypocrite, that kind of thing. A lot of parents feel like, well, I've had alcohol. I drank when I was younger, so therefore it's a foregone. It's not a foregone conclusion. Even in college, I was afraid to put a college chapter on the addiction inoculation because I figured, why bother? Turns out the vast majority of the alcohol that's consumed on college campuses is consumed by a very, very small minority of students. And it's actually pretty predictable who will drink and who won't, and who will be a problematic drinker and who won't in college, if you know some of the information that's in the book. So I think we tend to be kind of fatalistic about it. We tend to be like, oh, well, alcohol's been around forever. But we also haven't had great research into what alcohol actually does in the body and how damaging it actually is. I mean, alcohol, it's ethanol. It's a chemical. Like, if you're not going to, drink ethanol out of the gas pump, it's not likely, it's a damaging chemical. It's a carcinogen, all that sort of stuff. But we've been fed this line of, oh, it's healthy to have a glass of wine a day. It turns out that that's not always true, especially for women. It increases our risk of breast cancer. So as we get more information, we're battling back constantly those myths that we sort of grew up with, while trying to take in new information that's constantly changing. And so that's what I see my job as, is to say, okay, well, that was a myth. I believe that if I raised my kids, by having sips at home, that they could be like those European moderate children who didn't freak out when it came to alcohol. Well, I'm sorry, but the European Union has the highest rates of alcohol consumption in the world, disease related to alcohol consumption in the world, and death related to alcohol consumption in the world. And for kids who can't learn moderation, for people like me, no amount of watching other people moderate their alcohol, of being examples, is going to allow me to moderate my own alcohol. And before everyone comes screaming in your comments, yes, there are exceptions in Europe. But the cool thing is, the exceptions in Europe are countries that have a very low cultural tolerance for public drunkenness.
Right.
So there are countries where it's less cool to drink to excess. In fact, one country that has some of the highest rates of daily drinking has some of the lower rates of alcohol use disorder, because it's just not a part of the culture to be out there drinking yourself to
unconsciousness,
whatever, in the streets, to passing out in the streets.
Yeah. I mean, I love that fact myself. I really loved reading that, because I'd had many people say to me, "Oh, just give them a sip." And I'd say, no, I'm not. And I felt really terrible.
Go to the data, all of that Europe data is there under World Health Organization Europe. It's really easy to access.
Yep.
And Australia has made huge gains in their messaging around public health and drinking. They have lowered, Canada and Australia have done an incredible job of changing their messaging around how many units of alcohol per week are considered healthy. And as it turns out, no amount of alcohol is considered healthy, especially in people who are pregnant, blah, blah, blah. But but Canada and Australia have done such a great job turning around their public health messaging, and it's making a big difference.
Yeah. And look, even the school program itself was very similar to, I mean, my son came home and he has a lot of intolerance to foods and allergies to foods. And he came home and said, marijuana can cause schizophrenia or whatever. And I just said to him, you wouldn't want to be touching that stuff. It was a great thing for me to hear him come home with stuff like that. And so
I'm not a big fan of fear mongering.
No,
so just
it worked for me though. Yes.
Of course. Just to clarify, for parents out there, just to clarify, it is a really it is a very, very low risk for schizophrenia. However,
it's a factor.
If you have schizophrenia
in your family,
that would be a big topic of conversation for me. Look, schizophrenia is not something you want to mess around with. And we have schizophrenia in our family. So therefore, your risk of developing schizophrenia is higher and messing around with a drug like this is just not a great idea.
Yeah. So, I mean, I just grabbed the fact and ran with it at the time.
Oh, yeah. Go for it.
But I do, I love
scaring parents for no reason.
No, and this is your job. This is what you do. And you do it so well. So, look, what can we do? So, if you've got with teenagers, let's start talking right from the very beginning. So your suggestion is we just start talking. We have that conversation around drugs, around tablets, and all that type of thing. And it's all outlined in your book, which is another amazing, incredible book. Well worth a read for every single person, because we all know somebody who has this in their family or is suffering, from it themselves, or has kids that are taking drugs. So this is a fantastic book to help people. So what would be kind of the strategies? One of the strategies I just want you to quick talk about, because it's one strategy that I used all the time and spent many years on before we go, dinner time, sharing meals, staying connected, because you talk about it, and I've always done it. And I spent years saying, even to 18-year-olds, chew with your mouth closed, and ending up with a massive walk off at dinner time. But every night I set that table and I went right back again. And today, what I want to say is about that, before you tell us the value of it, is today my children are 30 and 28, and their partners come around. They all set the table. They all sit at the table, and we all sit around and we talk for hours. And I just want you to know, I think that is one of the most valuable family things that we can do.
That has come out in the research as something really valuable that parents can do, not just in preventing substance use disorder, but in preventing all kinds of high-risk behaviors and all kinds of other things. However, again, because not everyone has the privilege to, people who do shift work, people who work at night. There's a lot of people who can't do that. So what I'd like to stress is that it's not necessarily the dinner itself. It's about setting aside a specific time for family to be together and to talk about things like, no phones at the table. This is going to be, and you can talk about whatever it is you want to talk about. But the whole point is that conversation goes two ways, that there's a time for that to happen, and that there's not this whole, judgment, that there's support, that there's problem solving. So while I totally think that dinner time together is incredibly important, I just want to make it very clear that it is emblematic of something bigger, which is a time and place for family to reconnect and to talk. Even in our family, yes, we do eat dinner together. However, we also do this thing once a season. That was something I talked about in Gift of Failure, which is once a season, we each set 3 big goals for ourselves. And one of the goals has to be a little bit scary.
Okay.
And we write them down on an index card. And then in another season, in another 3 months or so, we come together and talk about how we did on reaching our goals. And it's your own goal, so no one cares if you made it or not. It's all about supporting each other. And that's a time when we get together and talk a lot. And there's a chapter in the book, if you want another example of something fun you can do, there's a chapter in the book that talks about where we emulated the show Hot Wings, which is an interview where Sean Evans, this guy, interviews people while eating spicy wings. And we did that because it was a really great way it was a show that my kids really loved. It was a way to have fun. And my husband and I created 10 questions, one for each wing.
Right.
And we didn't want to invade our children's privacy, but we ask them questions we might not normally have asked or have had access to the answers to. Like, which of your grandparents do you think you resemble most from a personality perspective, and why? And then if they had a different answer than we did, we were like, oh, that's interesting. I would have thought you would have said whoever. And that dinner lasted, I don't know, 2.5 hours. And it was a blast. So meet your kids where they are, find ways to communicate with them and connect with them on their terms, and just see how it goes. Try something fun.
Yeah, that is a fun activity. I might try that one, because it is. And
that one actually, if anyone wants to see what that's about. We did some vegan wings and then chicken wings. But if anyone wants to read that and doesn't have access to the whole book, that excerpt actually appears in the Washington Post.
Cool.
And that whole hot wings episode. So you can Google Jessica Lahey and hot wings and it should come up.
It is a fabulous idea. That's such a good idea. And really it is taking the time to listen at some stage, no matter when in your day.
Right.
And we are a big go out to coffee family and also have big chats over coffee.
Car trips.
Car trips are the best.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So really, what are the 3 most important things you think a parent could do right now to start inoculating their child?
So, number 1, parents who have a consistent and clear message of no, not until your brain is done developing when it comes to alcohol and drugs. And some people will say not until it's legal for you, which is fine, except for the fact that that's a just because I said so kind of answer, or just because they say so kind of answer. When you talk about your brain being done developing, that's a why answer. And kids really respond to the why better than the because I just said so. So parents who have a consistent, clear message of not until it's your brain is done developing have kids with much lower levels of substance use disorder during their lifetime. Parents who are permissive, who either give sips of their own at mealtimes or say, kids are going to drink anyway, I might as well have everyone over and take everyone's keys away. Those parents have kids with much higher levels of substance use disorder. And for the parents who invite other kids over and do that, you're also raising the risk of substance use disorder for your kids' friends, because peer group is a big part of this as well. So consistent and clear message of no, not until your brain is done developing. And keep in mind, I raised my kids 2 different ways. One before I researched this book, and one after I researched that book. And my daughter, who's a little pissed off that the rules changed, she knows why the rules changed. She knows that if I don't do those things, then what I'm saying is, I know the evidence, I've told you about the evidence, and yet I'm going to do this because it's easier for me. I'm going to let you have sips because it's easier for me, or I'm going to let you whatever because it's easier for me. I care about you, I love you, and I want to give you the best chance of going forward without developing substance use disorder. So therefore, we're going to use these rules. And giving kids an understanding of what it's doing in their brain, what it's doing to their lifelong risk and what it's doing to their brain. And that's why in the addiction inoculation, I talk a lot about the adolescent brain and what specifically substances are doing, so that you can turn to your kid and say, look, you're using weed, you're smoking cannabis. Well, kids who smoke cannabis more than twice a week can have smaller hippocampuses, which is the seat of memory formation and consolidation. Kids who smoke weed more than twice a week can have thinning in their frontal lobe, which can impede their ability to develop properly and be able to do all the adulting things that you're going to want to do. Giving them real information goes a long, long way.
Sure does. That's fabulous. Listen, thank you once again for an amazing conversation and so much information. And you're a fantastic researcher. And please thank your beautiful animals for sitting there listening after for the 5th interview today. So, Jess, can you just let the listeners know where they can find you again?
So everything is at jessicalahey.com. And those daily videos about the addiction inoculation and the gift of failure. Oh, a dog just found a squeaky toy. Those are all at my Instagram, at Teacher Lahey, or on my TikTok at Jess Lahey, and lots of other places as well. But you can even find a table of contents for all the videos I've ever done at jessicalahey.com under videos.
Fantastic. Thanks again for your brilliant information. That's wonderful.
You're so welcome. Thank you so much.
Great communication between you and your kids is so important. Being able to sit back with no judgment is huge. When discussing substance use with your kids, Jess recommends just start. Start as early as possible. Use age-appropriate examples and strategies. Giving them the knowledge and skills to use that knowledge is important. It is really stressful, but you can do it. Now keep going, because the more you talk, the easier it gets. Today is preferable to later. So create opportunities to talk. Get creative about where and when you talk. And don't forget to listen. Listen to hear, that is, not to talk. Remember, none of us are perfect, but we can all learn and use information to improve our future decisions and actions. When it comes to substance addiction, seeking help is crucial for recovery and reclaiming control over one's life. There are various avenues for assistance, ranging from professional treatment programs to support groups and counselling services. Additionally, reaching out to loved ones, friends or healthcare professionals for support and guidance can be a vital step towards recovery. No matter the path chosen, recognising the need for help is the first step towards healing and leading a healthier, substance-free life. Thank you for listening to Parenting and Personalities. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you could leave a rating and a review that would help others learn about this podcast. If you're interested in discovering more about you and your family's personality types, you'll find my book, Who Is This Monster or Treasure in My House, on Booktopia or Amazon. If you have an episode idea, please send a note to thepersonalitycoach@gmail.com. Many thanks to our producers at Stories and Strategies, and we'll see you next time.